here. And we will begin to talk about the beloved fourth wall of government, or that's what they're known as sometimes, a fourth branch or a fourth wall, the news media. And that entails all of these branches. And we know that in each of these branches, there's multiple smaller limbs that come out. Your mainstream traditional media stations, the big three, ABC, NBC, CBS. Now you have CNN, Fox, MSNBC, CNBC. Still thousands of newspapers, probably hundreds would be better to say. Thousands of newspapers if you think about the daily on the local level and county level. All kinds of internet, streaming sources of media, AM and FM radio stations, now satellite radio. And then, of course, you have your magazines. So we, I'm going to get to use a great word. We have a plethora of media in our country. So let's talk about it. And we will begin with the history of the news media in America. And we're just going to go back to the beginning of our country with the first president, George Washington. Even though you had sources of media before that, we're going to start with our country's founding. Do you remember that there was a conflict between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson? Just say yes and humor me.
Yes, sir.
All right, yeah. And Hamilton and Jefferson both were a part of Washington's cabinet. Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, a Federalist, and Jefferson was the Secretary of State, an anti-Federalist. And we already remember that they had differences of opinion about a national bank. Well, both of them enlisted a gentleman to start a newspaper. Hamilton enlisted a guy by the name of John Finno, and Finno started the Gazette of the United States.
Wow.
And this Gazette basically would report all of the policies in the Washington administration. And because they would do that, Hamilton made sure that the Gazette of the United States got all the financial contracts of the Department of the Treasury. Jefferson did not like that. He smelled a rat. So he got Philip Freneau to start the National Gazette. And the National Gazette was an opposition paper that published all the proceedings of the State Department. So really what you have here in these two newspapers that were began is a partisan press. which means this paper basically was Federalist friendly, and this paper was anti-Federalist friendly. Basically political press, partisan press. Each paper had a patron, and it was a political party in the government. So that would be the late 1700s, 1790s. As we move into the 1800s, new technology is being developed. For example, the telegraph is invented, and because of the telegraph, those who are the ones that man the telegraphs and control them and operate them, they can send out telegraphs almost immediately whenever something of great newsworthiness happens. So they have the advantage of a shorter time period of getting important news out. And then the printing press had already been invented, but it was more streamlined in the early 1800s. It was power driven so that they could print more papers much faster. And so several newspapers, their circulation grew, and with a larger circulation, you have more costs, but then they started advertising, and they would have advertisements in their newspapers, and so they had sponsors. So you had this occurring in the early 1800s, and if newspapers can have businesses sponsoring them and putting in advertisements, they will depend less and less upon the government. And if you're not depending so much upon the government, you really don't have to toe the line and just report about the government and what they want you to report about. And this continued through the 1800s. And then by 1900, you had newspapers that would have very high circulations. Some of them had up to 100,000 subscriptions. And advertising had really grown by then. And I think we had a question on this. Maybe I'm thinking of the American history class that I teach, but I think so. But you had these journalists who would write stories, and they would sensationalize them. And this was known as yellow journalism. And it would be where they would take an event and embellish it, add maybe some things that weren't exactly true to sensationalize the article and increase interest from the readers and maybe even add new subscribers. As you read our textbook, you'll see that there's a belief that two rich newspaper editors basically were the driving force in our nation getting in the Spanish-American War with their yellow journalism reporting of what was happening in Cuba. So maybe this scene from a well-known movie will illustrate yellow journalism.
What a charismatic quartet. Hello. I'm Rita Skeeter. I write for the Daily Prophet. But of course you know that, don't you? It's you we don't know. You're the juicy news.
About something?
Works lurk beneath it.
Is it coming in choppy?
No, we just can't. We're still in the slides.
It's what?
Still showing the slides.
It's not showing it?
No, we're just looking at the
Oh, okay. So you're still seeing the slides?
Yeah.
Now you're seeing the class, right?
Yeah.
Now can you see it?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm Rita Skeeter. I write for the Daily Prophet. But of course you know that, don't you? It's you we don't know. You're the juicy news. Lurk beneath those rosy cheeks. What mysteries to muscles mask. There's courage lie beneath those curls. In short, what makes a champion tick? Even so than I want to know. Not to mention my rabid readers. So, who's feeling up to sharing? Should we start with the youngest? Lovely. This is cozy. It's a room cupboard. You should feel right at home then. Don't mind if you use a quick Clutch Crow, do you? Oh, no. Sit down, me, Harry. Here you sit, a mere boy of 12. I'm 14. About to compete against 3 students, not only vastly more emotionally mature than yourself, to have mastered spells that you wouldn't attempt in your dizziest daydreams. Concerned? I don't know, I haven't really thought about it. Just ignore the queer. Of course, you're no ordinary boy of 12, are you? 14. Strong as legend. Do you think it was the trauma of your past that made you so keen to enter? No, I didn't enter. Of course you didn't. Everyone loves the rebel, Harry. Scratch that last. Speaking of your parents, were they alive? How do you think they feel? Proud or concerned that your attitude shows the best pathological need for attention? Worst psychotic death wish. Hey, my eyes aren't glistening with the ghosts of my past.
Yellow journalism. We live in a time where they don't do that anymore, right?
Not a doubt there.
All right, so I should have been moving these slides. As the technology increases, the partisanship decreases as far as political leanings, but you're having more journalists take license with their stories and trying to sell more papers. And so you're basically moving from one extreme of a, not exactly, but close to a government-controlled press to a unregulated one. And so this is going on, and then you have the advent of the radio station in the 1920s, because up until that point, print media was basically all there was besides the telegraph, and not everybody would receive a telegraph. It would be transmitted and then printed out. But you had radio stations crop up in the 1920s, and then in the 1940s and 50s, television came along, And then by the 1950s, 90% of Americans had a television. And so now there are several avenues or venues for news. And so because of these things, the yellow journalism, the radio broadcasts, television programming and news, there was a period where news moved to an objective period, which simply meant now nobody can be perfectly objective. But what the goal here was two things: to report facts, not opinion, and to be fair, so that those that have maybe an opposing opinion or an opposing view will also get a chance to share their side. Facts and fairness. And that led to the Fairness Doctrine in 1949, which required those who have a broadcast license to share about controversial things in an equal manner. So if you have a political candidate, for example, come onto your program, you must have the opponent to have also equal time to share their views. Now, the equal time rule only applies to the political candidates, but on other issues that wouldn't be of a political nature, other news reporting, there would need to be two sides to it, if that was something that was a part of it. And if there was just one side, then the reporters, they need to present the facts and not sprinkle it with their opinion. This doctrine was abolished in 1987. Any questions on the Fairness Doctrine or the history, just kind of the brief history of our news media?
No.
So it went from basically a partisan political arm to an objective, separate entity. And with the Fairness Doctrine rescinded, we're going to look at now, we're going to focus on the 30 years since then and the functions of the media and how it's become much more nuanced and complicated without the Fairness Doctrine. Some people, and you could imagine that it would depend upon their political leanings, some people blame Reagan since it happened during his presidency. Some people blame Reagan for Fox News and conservative talk radio. And some people celebrate Reagan, of course, those on the right, for allowing it to be that way. But probably what we need to focus on in this Fairness Doctrine being rescinded was the introduction in the 80s of cable TV. And for example, Ted Turner started CNN in 1980. The goal was to be neutral as a news channel. to report facts and to be fair. And so you had the rise of cable news in the 80s. And then you also had more FM radio stations obtaining frequencies. And so many FM stations completely devoted their time and their programs to talk radio. Used to be just basically on the AM stations, you'd have talk radio, but now you have several FM talk radio stations. At the same time, you had newspapers that were to hold to the fairness doctrine in the 80s, but they had the section called the editorial section, in which the editors or writers of that newspaper could share their own opinions. But it had to be, again, in the editorial section. The news articles still were to be objective and fair. Broadcasters, however, could not be. Broadcasters could not share their opinions on radio stations. This is the early 80s. And so in 87, the Fairness Doctrine rescinded that. And so that accelerated the rise of talk radio, cable television stations that were clearly biased in one direction, or they functioned along a partisan principle. So we will now move into the second part of chapter 10, the media and politics, because we saw that it began basically as being an arm of the political parties, and then it moved to a more objective entity. And now, even though news media stations and outlets will tell you that they are simply reporting the news, we know that there definitely is bias and opinion and political leanings in many of the, if not all of the news organizations, media outlets, whatever they might be. You guys can probably answer these questions very quickly. If you want a right-leaning television program you would watch, maybe you guys wouldn't know it. If you wanted to watch a television station that leaned to the Republicans, what would you watch? You guys aren't news watchers, are you?
No.
So that would be Fox. And if you wanted to watch a station that leaned heavily to the left, to Democrats, it would be
The View. That's what I was gonna say. That's
The View. The View. Well, they're not really a news channel, but I would have said MSNBC. I would have said CNN. If you watch The View, you will see, I think, is there 5 or 4 hosts? How many ladies are there usually? 5? So I think 3 of them would be to the left and 1 of them to the right, and then 1 kind of in the middle. So while they would say they kind of have a balance, they would be more left-leaning, yes. So we would call that an opinion show. And even though they might have someone that would be to the right, it leans more to the left. But anyway, as we talk about the media and politics, we want to think of the media in terms of being gatekeepers. So imagine the atmosphere of the earth. imagine that is a picture of all of what happens in all of the news that takes place in a day, all of the events, all of the happenings, all of the disasters, all of the things that the news media could report on. And then imagine the human race living in a big castle, and swirling around the castle are all these potential news stories. And the media functions as the gatekeepers. There's a big gate to the Capitol, and the media decides what things to report on, what things to allow into the castle of humanity. So that's kind of what we're talking about as a gatekeeper. So, for example, a volcano erupts somewhere in the South Pacific, and it's spewing lava and volcanic ash into the air. Most likely, the majority of national news media, they're going to bring that news into our living rooms. They're opening the gate to let that in. Now, let's say, for example, a shoe store in Japan, a shoe store in the mall, a shoe store in a mall in Japan catches on fire. Most likely, the local news station in Japan is going to report it, but CNN and Fox News and ABC here in America, they're not going to report that because it's really not world-shattering news. So again, they're functioning as a gatekeeper. They will control what news stories make it to the public and which ones don't. Now, they do have some criteria of what they want to report. They want, now, again, what makes the world go around? Money. And do you think these news media stations are wanting to make a profit?
Yes.
Yes. So they're going to want to have stories that appeal to more viewers. And because more viewers means they will watch the newscast, but then they'll probably watch the commercials that the advertisers put on these news outlets. And so that makes the advertisers happy. That keeps them continuing to advertise and pay money to the news media. And more people watching means improved ratings. And if your ratings improve, if you have more people watching, you're going to get more sponsors and more money. So they're going to pick stories that will appeal to large audiences. They are going to, and you'll want to know this concept on page 286. And it's not highlighted, but if you'll look in the top third of the page, about a third of the way down, they will cover what they call hard events. You see that phrase, hard events? So you want to know that. These are developments that have taken a clear and definable shape within the past 24 hours. So yesterday, for example, I was watching the or actually it was this morning. This morning, watching the morning news, and
Security alert.
I don't know why y'all are scared. I'm pretty sure it's testing it.
what happened?
We have a security alert going over the intercom, but
Okay, you don't have to leave or anything, do you?
no.
Okay. So this morning, a heart event was reported on the news. This is something that had happened since yesterday. If you're not familiar with what's going on with the presidency right now and the Ukraine situation, there was a whistleblower that reported last month about President Trump's phone call with the Ukrainian president. A whistleblower is someone who simply alerts the media to something that they believe is maybe illegal, but they don't want their name to be shared with the public. And so apparently in the last 24 hours, a second whistleblower has said that they too witnessed and know about the president's phone call with the president of Ukraine. So that would be a hard event. And then the news will be a gatekeeper about things that are changing on a regular basis. A big common example is during the election cycle, the news media will constantly talk about the latest presidential poll has Hillary ahead of Trump. And then the next day, a new poll has come out. Trump has caught up a little bit. So something that changes regularly will get a lot of press time. So as a gatekeeper, the news media usually has 4 functions. Oh, there's another one right there. And the mainstream media, they really like their role as a gatekeeper, and they do not care for the new outlets of media today, such as bloggers, YouTube channels, the new social media outlets that have really changed the game. They want to keep them out. The mainstream media wants to continue to be the gatekeepers. We'll talk more about that as we go on. But let's talk about 2 functions of the media very quickly. The first function is what we call the signaling function. This is on page 286 also. And basically, the signaling function is basically alerting the public to something important that is happening at that time. So you would see this on mainstream media today as a special report or as a breaking news alert. And that's what I was thinking about happened last night. Well, that was this morning also. Breaking news. The president, this was on this morning. Breaking news, the president has decided to withdraw troops from Syria. And so that was breaking news this morning. Now, this is primarily done by the traditional media. Your major stations like ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, C-SPAN, Fox, all those major traditional media. And an important function here is that even in reporting these special alerts, these breaking news issues, even then, the media is basically setting the agenda. So what we mean by that is, even though the media cannot tell us what to think, the media will tell the public what to think about, because they will report, they control what they report. So a lot of times we are hearing breaking news and special reports about the same things on different channels. This is different on the national level as opposed to the local level or even the state level. Because even on the state level, you can have different news outlets. Like if you live in the Oklahoma City area, you're going to be watching the Oklahoma City news stations. Those of us here in the southeast part of the state, we get the Tulsa stations. And then for those of you over where you guys are at, you get the Arkansas, the Northeast Arkansas or Northwest Arkansas news outlets. And you guys are going to hear about local things in the Fort Smith area that I'm not going to hear about because I get the Tulsa stations where I'm at. I might hear about the things in Muskogee, Bartlesville, things that are more local for the Tulsa area. So, but anyway, an example of this is in the 1990s, there was a saying among local news outlets, if it bleeds, it leads, which simply meant things that would be of a violent nature, crime, those would be the things that would lead a broadcast. Now, on the national level, the major news outlets usually focus on the same stories and usually interpret them the same way. There's not a whole lot of difference, except for the examples that we talked about earlier. Fox News is going to interpret this issue with our president and the president of Ukraine. They're going to interpret it from a conservative standpoint as opposed to CNN and MSNBC. But they're going to report the same facts or the same storylines, just interpret them in a different way. Many of the major news outlets, and here we're going to talk about, let's talk about those Tulsa stations, those Oklahoma City stations, those Fort Smith stations. All of them are going to get their stories on a national level from the same news service called what is called the AP service, Associated Press. The Associated Press is a wire service that provides information to local outlets. So on those levels, such as regional areas like Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Fort Smith, Dallas, they're going to be reporting on national stories much the same way. Only when you get into the major national networks like Fox and MSNBC will you start to see different interpretation. So that is the signaling function. The news media alerting the public to breaking news. A second function of the news media is what's called the common carrier function. This is basically where the news media is just a conduit for political leaders to communicate with the public. So they're a carrier of information from the political leaders to the American public. A common carrier function. A major example that will help us here is the executive branch of our government, the presidency, has adopted in the last few decades what's known as the Rose Garden strategy. And so if the president, for example, or if his cabinet wants to announce a major, or they want to make a major announcement, they will call a press conference in the Rose Garden where the president will address the major media on some issue. Here's President Bush a few years ago in the Rose Garden. Here is another president making an announcement in the Rose Garden. You can see the news media has gathered. And so this has been a way for the presidency to get information to the public. But even then, the news media manages the information that comes to the public. And what we mean by that is the media, in reporting something that the president would share with the public, the media controls it in a sense that they are going to make sure there is neutrality, politically speaking. So let's take Fox, for example. They are covering the president sharing something in the Rose Garden. And the president is responding to criticism. And the president seems angry. The president seems to be venting. Fox, they want to present a positive spin to it. So they're going to give a counterpoint to try to balance the president, who appears to be angry, and he's out to get revenge. So they're going to try to courier that information to the public and say something, well, he's got a right to be angry. He's being picked on. He's being singled out. Something to that nature. The other extreme would be MSNBC saying, yes, look at the president here. He is showing that he's unhinged and that he's not mentally fit, and he gets easily angered if he doesn't get his way. He's having a tantrum. And so even though the president may be able to share some news with the public, the media can still, in a sense, control how that is received. And then you have what are called sound bites. In the 1970s, for example, usually a president or an elected official, if they were to share something with the news, the average amount of time would be 42 seconds. Now, if you'll watch the news, maybe 10 seconds of media time will be allowed. So sound bites are shrinking, and what we're seeing here is even though the president or the Congress or a senator will try to use the media to convey information, the media can still manage how much is shared. So we'll stop there because we're over time, and we'll pick up there if there's no questions. All right, we'll see you all on Wednesday.
Hold on, I have a
Question?
question.
Yeah.
On the discussion, on our, where it actually talks about the modules,